The late afternoon sun dripped gold onto the cracked asphalt of Harmony Heights, a neighborhood perpetually caught between forgotten potential and simmering resentment. 10-year-old Elijah, a whirlwind of boundless energy and curious eyes, dribbled, a worn basketball, his rhythmic bounce the only consistent sound besides the distant hum of city traffic. He was oblivious to the weight Harmony Heights carried, the whispers of failing schools, the shadows of unemployment, and the invisible lines that segregated hope from despair. For Elijah, it was just home. Elijah was a dreamer, lost in worlds conjured from the well-worn pages of library books. He imagined himself an astronaut exploring Martian canyons, a detective solving intricate mysteries, a maestro conducting symphonies of the stars. His mind was a kaleidoscope, a vibrant escape from the muted realities of his surroundings. He was also undeniably his father's son. His father, Special Agent Marcus Hayes, was a fortress of quiet strength, a man forged in the crucible of duty and devotion. Marcus moved with the controlled grace of someone who had seen too much, a weariness etched into the lines around his kind yet resolute eyes. He was a dedicated FBI agent, respected for his sharp intellect, unwavering integrity, and an almost preternatural ability to read people. He was everything Harmony Heights and perhaps the city didn't think it deserved. Marcus had shielded Elijah from the darker aspects of his work, wanting his son to retain the unadulterated joy of childhood. He taught him to shoot hoops, helped him build elaborate Lego cities, and read him stories every night, his voice a soothing balm against the day's anxieties. He filled Elijah's world with love, stability, and the unwavering belief that he could be anything he dreamed of. But Marcus also knew that he couldn't protect Elijah from everything. He had witnessed firsthand the insidious nature of prejudice, the casual cruelty that could shatter innocence in an instant. He'd seen it in the files he reviewed, the cases he investigated, and the subtle, almost imperceptible biases that permeated even the highest echelons of law enforcement. He just prayed that Elijah wouldn't have to experience it. Today, Marcus was running late. He had promised Elijah they would practice his free throws, a ritual they both cherished. A particularly difficult case, a network of corrupt officials siphoning funds from community programs, had kept him tied up in meetings, his frustration mounting with each passing hour. He glanced at his watch, a familiar knot of guilt tightening in his stomach. Meanwhile, Officer Kevin Riley patrolled Harmony Heights, his gaze hard and judgmental. Riley was a recent transfer, eager to prove himself, but his ambition was fueled by a toxic blend of insecurity and prejudice. He saw Harmony Heights not as a community struggling to survive, but as a breeding ground for crime, a place where law and order were constantly under siege. He saw young black boys not as children with dreams, but as potential threats, statistics waiting to happen. Riley's perspective had been warped by years of subtle indoctrination, by the insidious narratives that painted certain communities with broad negative strokes. He'd heard the whispers in the locker room, the jokes, the casual dehumanization that slowly eroded empathy and replaced it with fear. He was primed to see danger where it didn't exist, to interpret innocence as defiance. As Riley's patrol car crept down the street, he spotted Elijah dribbling his basketball. The setting sun cast long shadows, momentarily obscuring the boy's features. Riley's hand instinctively tightened on his holster. Something about the way Elijah moved, the intensity in his focus, triggered a primal alarm in his mind, an alarm fueled by implicit biases. Riley slammed on the brakes, the screech of tires shattering the evening calm. Elijah, startled, fumbled the ball. It bounced harmlessly into the street. Riley, his adrenaline surging, jumped out of the car, his voice booming, "Freeze! Police, don't move!" Elijah, his heart pounding in his chest, froze, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. He didn't understand what was happening. He just knew that the man in the uniform, his face contorted with anger, was pointing a gun at him. Riley, blinded by his own fear and prejudice, saw only a potential threat. He saw the shadows, not the child. He saw a statistic, not a soul. He saw everything he'd been taught to fear, and nothing of the innocence that stood before him. He saw a reason to act, a reason to justify his fear. He raised his weapon. The world seemed to slow to a crawl for Elijah. The officer's booming voice, the glint of sunlight on the polished metal of the gun, the sudden surge of fear. It all coalesced into a single, terrifying moment. He wanted to run, to hide, to scream, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer force of the officer's aggression. I didn't do anything. Elijah stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He tried to raise his hands in a gesture of surrender, but Riley's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Riley barked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He saw Elijah's hesitation as defiance, confirmation of his preconceived notions. He imagined the boy reaching for a weapon, a threat, lurking just beneath the surface. In reality, Elijah was just a terrified child, struggling to comprehend the situation. He had never been in trouble with the police before. He didn't understand why this man was pointing a gun at him. The officer's words were a garbled mess, his anger palpable. Across town, Marcus, still trapped in the endless meeting, felt a sudden, inexplicable pang of anxiety. A cold dread washed over him, a feeling he couldn't shake. He tried to dismiss it as stress, but the feeling persisted, a gnawing unease that burrowed deep into his gut. He excused himself from the meeting, feigning a sudden illness. He needed to see Elijah, to reassure himself that he was safe. He promised himself he would leave work early, no matter the consequences. Back in Harmony Heights, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the shouting and the sight of the armed officer. Mrs. Rodriguez, a kindly woman who lived across the street from Elijah, recognized him instantly. Her heart leaped into her throat. "That's just Elijah," she cried out, her voice laced with fear. "He's a good boy. He wouldn't hurt anyone." Riley ignored her, his focus solely on Elijah. He was convinced he was in control, that he was doing what was necessary to maintain order. He didn't see the fear in Elijah's eyes, the innocence etched on his face. He didn't hear Mrs. Rodriguez's desperate plea. He was too consumed by his own distorted perception of reality. Another neighbor, Mr. Johnson, a retired veteran, cautiously approached the scene. He recognized Riley as the new officer who had been patrolling the neighborhood with increasing aggression. He had witnessed Riley's heavy-handed tactics, his condescending attitude, his thinly veiled contempt for the residents of Harmony Heights. "Officer, what's going on here?" Mr. Johnson asked, his voice calm but firm. "That's just a child. He hasn't done anything wrong." Riley glared at Mr. Johnson, his anger flaring. "Stay back," he yelled. "This is police business. I have reason to believe this individual is a threat." Mr. Johnson, his eyes filled with concern, refused to back down. He knew that Riley was acting irrationally, that his judgment was clouded by prejudice. He couldn't stand by and watch as this innocent boy was subjected to such unwarranted aggression. "Officer, please," he pleaded, his voice laced with desperation. "Just talk to him. You're scaring him." But Riley was beyond reason. He was trapped in a self-reinforcing cycle of fear and prejudice. He saw Mr. Johnson's intervention as a challenge to his authority, further fueling his paranoia. "I said stay back," Riley shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. He raised his weapon higher, his finger tightening on the trigger. Elijah, overwhelmed by fear, began to cry. Tears streamed down his face, blurring his vision. He didn't understand why this was happening to him. He just wanted to go home, to be safe in his father's arms. "Daddy," he cried out, his voice choked with sobs. "I want my daddy." The sound of Elijah's voice, the raw, unadulterated plea for his father, pierced through the haze of Riley's fear. For a fleeting moment he saw Elijah not as a threat, but as a child, a scared and vulnerable human being. But the moment passed. The years of indoctrination, the ingrained prejudices, the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long resurfaced with renewed force. He convinced himself that Elijah was acting, that his tears were a ploy to distract him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had a job to do, a responsibility to protect the community. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. He aimed the gun at Elijah's chest. "Don't move," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Or I will shoot." Elijah, his body shaking uncontrollably, closed his eyes. He braced himself for the impact, for the pain he knew was coming. He whispered a silent prayer, a plea for his father to come and save him. Marcus, speeding through the city streets, his heart pounding in his chest, felt a sharp, agonizing pain in his chest. It was as if someone had plunged a knife into his heart. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Elijah was in danger. He pushed the accelerator to the floor, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of his son. He prayed that he wasn't too late. Back in Harmony Heights, Riley's finger tightened on the trigger. The crowd held its breath, their eyes wide with horror. Mrs. Rodriguez screamed, a sound that ripped through the silence. And then, the unthinkable happened. The deafening crack of the gunshot ripped through the air, shattering the fragile peace of Harmony Heights. Time seemed to distort and bend. Elijah felt a searing pain erupt in his shoulder, a shockwave that threw him backward onto the asphalt. He screamed, a primal sound of agony and terror. The crowd erupted in chaos. People screamed, cried, and surged forward, desperate to help. Mrs. Rodriguez collapsed, her body racked with sobs. Mr. Johnson, his face contorted with rage, lunged at Riley, attempting to disarm him. Riley, his face pale and sweaty, stared in disbelief at the smoking gun in his hand. He hadn't meant to shoot. It was an accident, a terrible, tragic mistake. But the reality of what he had done slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. He had shot a child, an innocent, unarmed child. Panic seized him. He knew his career was over, his life irrevocably changed. The consequences of his actions, the weight of his prejudice, crashed down on him, crushing him beneath their weight. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting around frantically, searching for an escape. As the crowd surged closer, threatening to overwhelm him, Riley saw a familiar black sedan screech to a halt at the edge of the crowd. A tall, imposing figure emerged from the car, his face a mask of fury. It was Marcus. He had heard the gunshot as he rounded the corner, his heart sinking with a sickening certainty. He had seen the chaos, the screaming crowd, the fallen figure, on the ground. He knew instantly that it was Elijah. His world narrowed, focusing solely on his son. He pushed through the crowd, his eyes locked on Elijah's limp form. He saw the blood, the pain, the fear etched on his son's face. A cold, white rage consumed him, a rage he had never felt before. He reached Elijah, dropping to his knees beside him. He cradled his son's head in his arms, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and love. "Elijah! Elijah, can you hear me? It's Daddy. I'm here." Elijah groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He saw his father's face, his familiar, comforting face, and a wave of relief washed over him. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice weak and strained. "It hurts." "I know, baby," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know. But I'm here now. You're going to be okay." He ripped off his tie, using it to apply pressure to Elijah's wound. He yelled for someone to call an ambulance, his voice a thunderous roar that cut through the chaos. Then his gaze turned towards Riley. The transformation was terrifying. The grief-stricken father, the loving protector, vanished, replaced by a predator, a force of nature unleashed. His eyes, once warm and kind, were now filled with a cold, burning fury. He stalked towards Riley, his movements deliberate and menacing. The crowd parted before him, sensing the raw power emanating from him. Riley, his face ashen, backed away, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. But he hesitated. He knew he couldn't shoot again, not with Marcus standing before him, not with the entire neighborhood watching. "You," Marcus growled, his voice a low, guttural rumble. "You did this," Riley stammered, his voice trembling with fear. I didn't mean to. It was an accident." Marcus stopped a few feet from Riley, his eyes boring into him. He saw the fear, the remorse, the desperate attempts at justification, but he saw something else too. The ingrained prejudice, the toxic biases that had led Riley to believe he could shoot a child without consequences. He raised his hand, his fist clenching. The crowd gasped, anticipating the inevitable. But Marcus didn't strike. He knew that violence wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't undo what had been done. It wouldn't heal Elijah's wound. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his FBI badge. He held it up for Riley to see, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice dripping with venom. Riley's eyes widened in recognition. He had heard the rumors, the whispers about the high-ranking FBI agent who lived in Harmony Heights. He knew that Marcus Hayes was a force to be reckoned with, a man who commanded respect and wielded considerable power. You're Agent Hayes," Riley stammered, his voice barely audible. "That's right," Marcus said, his voice cold and unwavering. "And that boy you shot? That's my son. And you, Officer Riley, are about to learn what it means to mess with the wrong family." The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus knew that he needed to focus on Elijah, to ensure that he received the medical attention he needed. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. Justice would be served. He would make sure of it. He knelt back down beside Elijah, stroking his hair gently. "I'm here, son," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." The paramedics arrived, quickly assessing Elijah's condition. They carefully loaded him onto a stretcher and into the ambulance, Marcus riding alongside him, his hand clutching his son's. As the ambulance sped away, leaving behind the chaos and the recriminations, Marcus knew that everything had changed. His life, his family, his community would never be the same. He had been forced to confront the reality of the world he lived in, the insidious prejudices that threatened to destroy everything he held dear. And he knew that he had a choice to make. He could retreat, hide, and protect his family from the world's darkness. Or he could fight back, use his power and influence to challenge the injustices that had led to this moment. He looked down at Elijah's pale face, his eyes filled with determination. He knew what he had to do. He had to fight. For Elijah, for Harmony Heights, for a world where children could play in the streets without fear. The climax had passed, but the battle had just begun. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, a chaotic blend of medical procedures, legal proceedings, and media frenzy. Elijah underwent surgery to remove the bullet fragment from his shoulder. The physical wound would heal, but the emotional scars ran much deeper. He was withdrawn, haunted by nightmares, and clung to Marcus like a lifeline. Marcus, consumed by a potent mix of grief, anger, and determination, became a force of nature. He used his influence within the FBI to launch a full-scale investigation into the shooting, demanding accountability at every level. He refused to let Riley's actions be swept under the rug, to be dismissed as a simple mistake. He wanted justice, not just for Elijah, but for every child who had been victimized by prejudice and abuse of power. The media seized upon the story, turning Harmony Heights into a battleground for competing narratives. Some painted Riley as a rogue officer, a bad apple acting alone. Others portrayed Marcus as an overprotective father, using his power to exact revenge. But the truth, as always, was far more complex. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of misconduct within the Harmony Heights precinct. Several officers had filed complaints against Riley, citing his aggressive tactics and his openly expressed biases. But their concerns had been ignored, dismissed by superiors who were either complicit or simply indifferent. The revelation sparked outrage throughout the city. Protests erupted, demanding police reform and accountability. Community. Leaders called for a federal investigation, accusing the police department of systemic racism. The mayor, facing mounting pressure, promised to take action, but his words rang hollow. Meanwhile, Riley was placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. He retreated into his home, surrounded by a fortress of fear and denial. He couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what he had done, the ripple effects that had spread throughout the city. He saw himself as a victim, unfairly targeted by a powerful FBI agent. Marcus, however, refused to let Riley off the hook. He worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a case that would ensure Riley was held accountable for his actions. He knew that this was more than just a personal vendetta. It was a fight for the soul of Harmony Heights, a battle against the systemic injustices that had plagued the community for generations. He also knew that he had to be careful. He was walking a tightrope, balancing his personal grief with his professional responsibilities. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment or allow his desire for revenge to compromise the integrity of the investigation. He had to remain above reproach to prove that he was acting not out of personal animosity, but out of a commitment to justice. As the investigation progressed, Marcus found himself drawn closer to the community he had always tried to protect. He attended town hall meetings, listened to the concerns of the residents, and offered his support. He realized that he couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed the support of the community, their courage, their resilience, their unwavering belief in the possibility of change. Mrs. Rodriguez became a staunch ally, organizing community events to raise awareness and support for Elijah. Mr. Johnson, drawing on his military experience, helped to coordinate security and provide protection for those who were being targeted by intimidation tactics. The residents of Harmony Heights, despite their fear and their past experiences with disappointment, rallied together, united by a shared sense of purpose. Elijah, slowly but surely, began to heal. He still had nightmares, but they were becoming less frequent. He started to play basketball again, his movements tentative at first, but gradually regaining his confidence. He found solace in the support of his community, the unwavering love of his father, and the knowledge that he was not alone. He also began to understand the significance of what had happened to him. He realized that he had become a symbol, a catalyst for change. He didn't ask for it, he didn't want it, but he accepted it with a quiet dignity. He knew that he had a responsibility to speak out, to share his story, to inspire others to fight for justice. The falling action was a period of intense reflection, a time for healing, for rebuilding, and for preparing for the final confrontation. The consequences of Riley's actions had rippled throughout Harmony Heights, exposing the fault lines of prejudice and inequality. But they had also sparked a fire, a determination to fight for a better future. The community was ready. Marcus was ready. And Elijah, despite his pain and his fear, was ready too. The trial of Officer Kevin Riley dominated headlines for weeks. The prosecution, armed with irrefutable evidence gathered by Marcus and his team, painted a damning portrait of a man driven by prejudice and a reckless disregard for human life. The defense argued that it was an accident, a tragic mistake made in the heat of the moment. But the jury wasn't buying it. After days of deliberation, they returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Riley was convicted of aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and violation of Elijah's civil rights. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his career and his reputation in ruins. The verdict was met with jubilation in Harmony Heights. People poured into the streets, celebrating the victory, the vindication of their faith in the justice system. But Marcus knew that the battle was far from over. Riley's conviction was just one step in a long and arduous journey. The police chief was forced to resign, and the entire leadership of the Harmony Heights precinct was replaced. A series of reforms were implemented, including mandatory bias training, increased community oversight, and stricter accountability measures. The police department pledged to rebuild trust with the community, to foster a culture of respect and understanding. Marcus, however, wasn't content with superficial changes. He used his influence within the FBI to launch a broader investigation into systemic racism within law enforcement. He wanted to root out the insidious biases that permeated the system, to create a world where no child would ever have to fear the police. He also made a conscious decision to step back from his high-profile cases and focus on community outreach. He established a foundation to provide support for victims of police brutality and to promote education and opportunity in underserved communities. He became a mentor to young people, sharing his story and inspiring them to pursue their dreams. Elijah, now a young man, became an advocate for social justice, using his voice to speak out against inequality and discrimination. He traveled the country, sharing his story with audiences large and small, inspiring them to take action, to fight for a more just and equitable world. Years later, Marcus stood beside Elijah as he graduated from law school, his heart swelling with pride. He had faced unimaginable adversity, but he had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever to make a difference in the world. As they walked away from the ceremony, Marcus placed his hand on Elijah's shoulder, his eyes filled with love and admiration. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've come a long way." Elijah smiled, his eyes shining with hope. "We both have, Dad," he said. "We both have." The scars of the past would always remain, a reminder of the pain and the injustice that they had endured. But they had also learned a valuable lesson, that even in the darkest of times, hope can endure, and that even the smallest of voices can spark a revolution. The ending is not perfect, but it is hopeful. It's a testament to the power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unwavering pursuit of justice, and it's a reminder that the fight for a better world is never truly over. It demands constant vigilance, unwavering commitment, and the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it's difficult.